It was a winter like no other. The kind of winter that makes you feel like the world is paused, holding its breath under a blanket of snow. I had just finalized my divorce 6 months prior, and the weight of it still clung to me like a shadow. My girlfriend, Clara, suggested we get away. Somewhere quiet, somewhere far from the noise of the city and the echoes of my failed marriage. We found a cabin on a lake in northern Minnesota, a place so remote it felt like the edge of the world. I booked it without hesitation. The cabin was exactly what I needed, modern yet cozy, with large windows that overlooked the frozen lake. The surrounding woods were dense, and the nearest neighbor was a half-mile away. Most of the other properties along the shoreline were empty, their owners long gone for season. It was perfect. I wanted to be as far from civilization as possible, and this place delivered. The host, a man named Greg, wasn't going to be there, but he left detailed instructions on where to find the keys and how to work the fireplace. Standard Airbnb stuff. We arrived in late afternoon, the sun already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow. As we approached the front steps, I noticed a small package sitting by the door. There was no return address, just a handwritten note that read, "Enjoy your stay. Stay warm." Clara picked it up and opened it. Inside was a small box of matches. We exchanged a glance, shrugged, and laughed it off. "Guess they really want us to stay warm," she said, tossing the matches onto the kitchen counter. The first 2 days were exactly what we needed. Long walks through the snow-covered woods, hot cocoa by the fireplace, and the kind of silence that feels like a balm to the soul. The snow fell steadily, blanketing the landscape in pristine white. It was peaceful, serene, until the third night. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was a wind, but as I lay there, I realized it was something else. Something mechanical. I got out of bed quietly, careful not to wake Clara, and made my way to the window. The snow was falling heavily now, almost a blizzard, but through the haze, I saw it. A snowmobile, moving slowly across the frozen lake. My first thought was confusion. Who would be out on the lake at this hour, in this weather? The snowmobile stopped, and the driver climbed off, waving their arms frantically. It looked like they were shouting, but the wind drowned out their voice. My stomach dropped when I realized they were facing our cabin. I woke Clara and told her what was happening. She stayed inside while I grabbed my coat and boots and stepped out onto the deck. The cold hit me like a wall, biting through my layers. The person on the ice was a woman, bundled in a thick parka, her face barely visible under a fur-lined hood. She was shouting for help, her voice cracking with desperation. "Please, my son, he's out here somewhere." He ran off into the storm. My heart sank. A child lost in this weather? I didn't hesitate. I told Clara to call the police and started making my way toward the lake. The ice was solid, no risk of cracking, but the snow made every step a struggle. As I got closer, the woman kept shouting, her voice growing more frantic. "He's only 8. Please, you have to help me find him." I was about to ask her more questions when she said something that stopped me cold. "Did you get the matches?" For a moment, I didn't understand. Then it hit me, the package, the note, the matches. She had left them. This wasn't a random encounter. Before I could react, she reached into her coat and pulled out a gun. "Give me your wallet and phone. Now!" I handed them over, my hands shaking. She climbed back onto the snowmobile and disappeared into the storm, leaving me standing there, frozen in more ways than one. I ran back to the cabin, shouting for Clara to lock the doors. The police arrived an hour later, but by then, the snow had covered any tracks. They searched the area but found nothing. No snowmobile, no woman, no child. The Airbnb host refunded our stay, claiming he had no idea about the package or the woman. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was involved. How else would she have known we were there? Clara and I left the next morning, cutting our trip short. I couldn't get the image of that woman out of my head. Her desperate pleas, the gun, the matches. It didn't make sense. Why go through all that trouble just to rob us? A year later, I found myself at my family's lake house in northern Wisconsin. It was a place filled with childhood memories, swimming bonfires, lazy summer days. But this trip was different. My parents had rented the house to an elderly man named Walter, a veteran who had fallen on hard times. He seemed harmless enough, but there was something about him that made my skin crawl. Walter had been living in the house for a year, and my parents had only checked on him a handful of times. They trusted him to take care of the place, but I always had my doubts. When we arrived for our annual summer trip, something felt off. The house was in disarray, and Walter was nowhere to be found. That first night, we heard noises coming from the attic. My dad went up to investigate and found Walter hiding there, surrounded by old family photos and trinkets he had stolen from around the house. He looked like a ghost, his eyes hollow, his hands trembling. My dad, ever compassionate one, wanted to let him go, but my mom insisted on calling the police. When they arrived, they found a stash of stolen items in the attic, along with a journal filled with disturbing entries. Walter had been watching us for years, documenting our comings and goings, our routines, our lives. It was chilling. The police took him away, but the damage was done. The lake house, once a place of joy and comfort, now felt tainted. Last summer, my friend Ethan invited me to his family's lake house in upstate New York. It was a sprawling property on a secluded lake, the kind of place where the wealthy go to escape. Ethan's parents were never around, so we had the run of the place. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend, just two friends hanging out, fishing, and drinking beer. But on our second night, we saw something strange. A light flickering across the lake, blinking in a pattern. Ethan recognized it immediately. Morse code. SOS. Someone was in trouble. Against our better judgment, we decided to investigate. We grabbed a couple of flashlights and rowed across the lake to the source of the light. The house was abandoned, its windows dark, its dock crumbling. As we approached, the light stopped. We climbed through an open window and searched the house, but it was empty. Too empty. In one of the upstairs rooms, we found an old projector aimed at the window. It was still warm. That's when we realized it was a trap. We heard footsteps behind us and bolted, running back to the boat as fast as we could. We didn't stop until we were back at Ethan's house, locking every door and window behind us. The police found nothing when they searched the house. No one had been there, they said, but I know what we saw. Someone had set that up, someone who wanted us to come looking. I still don't know why, and I'm not sure I want to. It was the summer of 2018, and I was in desperate need of a break. My life had become a whirlwind of deadlines, failed relationships, and sleepless nights. My best friend, Marcus, suggested we take a trip to the coast. Somewhere quiet, he said, where we can just breathe. We found a rental listing for a lighthouse keeper's cottage on Black Rock, a small island off the coast of Maine. The photos showed a rugged, wind-swept landscape with the lighthouse towering over the cottage. It looked isolated, peaceful, and exactly what I needed. We arrived on a foggy afternoon, the kind of weather that makes everything feel muted and distant. The ferry dropped us off at the island's only dock, and we were met by Elias, the elderly caretaker. He was a wiry man with a face weathered by years of salt and wind. His eyes, though kind, held a distant, almost haunted look. He helped us load our bags into a rusty pickup truck and drove us up the winding path to the cottage. The cottage was quaint, with whitewashed walls and a red tin roof. The lighthouse stood a few hundred yards away, its beam cutting through the mist. Elias gave us a quick tour, showing us the basics: the kitchen, the wood stove, the generator. Before he left, he handed me a small, weathered box. "A welcome gift," he said with a cryptic smile. Inside was an old brass key and a note that read, "For the lighthouse, if you're curious." The first 2 days were perfect. We explored the rocky shoreline, collected seashells, and spent hours sitting on the porch, watching the waves crash against the cliffs. The lighthouse loomed in the background, its steady beam a comforting presence. At night, we lit a fire in the wood stove and played cards by the flickering light. The isolation was exactly what I needed. No cell service, no internet, just the sound of the ocean and the occasional cry of a gull. But on the third night, things took a turn. I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the gravel path outside. At first, I thought it was Marcus, but when I checked his room, he was fast asleep. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The fog was thick, and the beam of my light barely pierced through it. The footsteps led toward the lighthouse. Against my better judgment, I followed. The lighthouse door was slightly ajar, and the brass key Elias had given me fit perfectly into the lock. Inside, the air was damp and cold. The spiral staircase creaked as I climbed, my flashlight casting flickering shadows on the walls. At the top, I found the source of the footsteps, a man in a tattered coat, staring out to sea through the lighthouse lens. He turned to me, his face gaunt and pale, and whispered, "You shouldn't be here." I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing on the stairs. By the time I reached the bottom, the man was gone. I ran back to the cottage and woke Marcus, but when we returned to the lighthouse, there was no sign of anyone. The key was still in the lock, and the door was closed tight. The next morning, we found Elias waiting for us on the porch. He looked uneasy, his hands trembling as he lit a pipe. "You saw him, didn't you?" he asked. I nodded and he sighed. That was Henry, the last keeper. He disappeared 50 years ago, but some say he never left. Elias explained that Henry had been obsessed with the lighthouse, spending every waking moment tending to it. One night, during a violent storm, he vanished without a trace. Some believe he'd been swept out to sea, while others claimed he'd become part of the lighthouse itself. Elias warned us to stay away from the lighthouse at night. "It's not just Henry," he said. "The island has a way of holding on to things, memories, people, even the dead." That night, the storm returned. The wind howled, and the waves crashed against the cliff with a fury that shook the cottage. I woke to the sound of the lighthouse alarm blaring, a deep, mournful sound that echoed across the island. Marcus and I grabbed our coats and ran toward the lighthouse, the rain soaking us to the bone. At the top, we found Henry again, his hands gripping the lens as if trying to steady it. He turned to us, his eyes filled with desperation. "It's coming," he said, his voice barely audible over the storm. "You have to leave." Before we could respond, the lighthouse shuddered and the beam flickered. Marcus grabbed my arm and pulled me down the stairs just as the light went out. We barely made it back to the cottage before the storm reached its peak. The next morning, the lighthouse was dark, its lens shattered. Elias was gone, leaving only a note on the kitchen table. Some places hold on to their secrets. Black Rock is one of them. We left that afternoon, the island disappearing into fog behind us. To this day, I don't know if Henry was a ghost, a figment of my imagination, or something else entirely. But I do know this: some places are better left unexplored. A year later, I found myself drawn back to Black Rock. I couldn't explain why, but the island had stayed with me, haunting my dreams and waking thoughts. Marcus refused to come, saying he'd had enough of ghost stories and bad weather, so I went alone. The cottage was just as we left it, though the lighthouse looked even more decrepit. The lens was still shattered, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. I spent the first day cleaning up, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I heard the footsteps again. This time, I didn't follow them. I stayed in the cottage, the fire crackling in the stove, and tried to ignore the sound of the lighthouse alarm blaring in the distance. But as the night wore on, the noise grew louder, more insistent. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the lighthouse. At the top, I found Henry again, but this time, he wasn't alone. A woman stood beside him, her face pale and her eyes hollow. She reached out to me, her hand trembling, and whispered, "Help us." I woke up on the cottage floor, the sun streaming through the windows. The lighthouse was silent, its beams still dark. I packed my bags and left that afternoon, vowing never to return. Years later, I stumbled across an old newspaper article about Black Rock. It mentioned Henry and his wife, who had disappeared during a storm in 1968. The article speculated that they had been swept out to sea, but their bodies were never found. The lighthouse had been abandoned ever since, its beam extinguished. I don't know if Henry and his wife are still there, trapped in the lighthouse, or the island itself is alive, holding on to its secrets. But I do know this: some places are better left alone. Black Rock is one of them.